To the galaxy's great misfortune, Hive Fleet Leviathan had yet to reveal the full extent of its power. More mass slaughter and terrible destruction was still to come as fresh tendrils of the Hive Fleet slid into Segmentum Pacificus in the galactic west. The first warnings of the dire Tyranid threat encroaching upon the Imperium's western border were, to all intents and purposes, ignored. The colossal creaking bureaucracy of the Emperor's domain placed written records of panicked aid requests at the bottom of overflowing missive stacks, or else failed to notice the total silence of entire systems. Only after gaining a powerful foothold did Leviathan's true surge through Segmentum Pacificus begin. Spearheaded by two colossal tendrils, dozens of Imperial systems were assailed or overwhelmed alongside Orc Empires, Necron Tombworlds, Pirate Lairs, and leagues of Votan holdings, which also found themselves embroiled in ferocious fights for survival that few endured for long. Still, it took precious time for the great good and powerful of the Imperium to understand the scale of the danger facing the galactic west. Though within various Imperial regions, the Tyranid invaders were recognized as a genuine threat, and the two tendrils given codenames Nautilon and Promethor, unreliable information resulted in the Imperial response being tragically inconsistent. On some worlds, planetary governors ordered huge militias be assembled and mighty defenses constructed. From others, planetary leaders fled, abandoning their homes before it was too late. Others still did nothing, declaring in earnest that the protection of the Emperor meant there was no danger, or through catastrophic complacency believed that the threat was minimal or non-existent to them. Few agents of the Imperium saw the true danger for what it was. The two tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan were on a parallel path, one that would see both storm straight into Segmentum Solar if not halted. Slowly, however, fragments of information regarding this horror were put together. So the Tyranids are back, ladies and gentlemen, and they are quite literally badder than ever. You might have noticed this if you played Space Marine 2. There are quite literally an unending number of them. And within the wider context of Warhammer 40K, this has been a huge plot development. So the Imperium was kind of starting to get things together after the revival of Roboute Guilliman. But now we've got Pariah Nexus and we've got the Fourth Tyrannic War, and we barely survived the Third Tyrannic War. If it wasn't for the reinforcements of Belisarius Cawl and, quite frankly, the aid of some Khornate demons, the Hive Fleet Leviathan would have wiped out the Galactic East. However, now we find out that the larger Tyranid threat has come into the Galactic West, and Terra is potentially in danger, and this has not happened for a very long time within Warhammer 40k, and the fact that we may see essentially a second Siege of Terra, or sorry, I guess already a third Siege of Terra in the future, given that the Tyranids may come that close to the birth world of humanity. It's a fantastical thought. Ultimately, for the setting to move forward, personally, I believe that the writers need to kind of find out a way to kind of deal with the Tyranids relatively quickly, or at least to get them to a sort of stalemate. One of the big issues people have with the Tyranids, and I totally feel all this, is that the Tyranids are kind of too powerful. They can kind of adapt to the things we throw at them, and there are endless numbers. It is said in one book that there are thought to be more Hive Fleets or Hive Fleet tendrils than there are worlds within the Milky Way galaxy. That's a horrific prospect. So the Imperium needs some big weapons to deal with these guys, and thankfully, we've got them. So the people might not have heard this, but in some of the recent Warhammer 40k lore books, the Imperium has been developing colossal weapons that are intended, or at least can be used, to destroy the Tyranids, or at least massively reduce their numbers. We're going to look at two books today, and the first is called Deathworlder by Victoria Hayward. And this is a really interesting example because what we're going to talk about, technically speaking, is not a weapon, but as you'll see, it ends up being a very, very powerful tool against the Tyranids. The story of Deathworlder takes place on the planet of Lajalai, a rather unique mining world within the Emperor's realm. A long time ago, Whoever lived on this planet had done something unnatural to Lazulai's mantle to force the growth of rare minerals. A kaleidoscope of jewels had thrust their way through whatever indigenous rock had originally formed the Earth, bursting seams for themselves like crystalline worms tunneling across the planet, forcing aside duller geologies in their gaudy wake. Despite being quite literally a jewel of the Emperor's realm, this world was now lost. The invading Tyranids had all but won. Major Wolf Khan of the Catachan 903rd and her team are tasked with retrieving an ancient device suggested to be some kind of weapon created in mankind's distant past. It had been discovered by Magos Rainer Stull during his excavation on Lazulai. When they reached the facility of the Magos, however, he was absent, and the device itself was revealed to be not merely a weapon, but something far more powerful and valuable. It is a world maker, an engine of creation, older than the world in its current form, and possessing a capability to reshape planets, potentially reviving dead ones. You are in the presence of a mighty machine spirit, a sacred presence of a magnitude and power I had not envisaged. This mission may have brought us to the most significant discovery made by my peers for centuries. Magos Rainer Stull discovered the device, but wanted to keep all credit for himself. He refused to share his knowledge which could well have saved the planet. However, he did also recognize the device's inherent instabilities, warning of the risks involved in its operation. Furthermore, the device was embedded deep within the planet's core, drawing power from it and making its removal impossible. This limitation forces Khan's squad to consider alternative ways to utilize and neutralize the device. Adept Wraith sacrificed herself to operate the machine. The engine unleashed a wave of energy that spreads across Lazulai, transforming the planet and disrupting the Tyranid forces. Below them, the final unmaking of the world and everything on it unfolded. Anditz closed his eyes, momentarily blinded as Lazulai ended, not in blood and bone, but radiant light. Then something ruptured off to one side, rocking the little shuttle violently. "It's one of the Tyranid vessels," Adair shouted. Anditz stared as another of the Xenos burst in a cascade of gold light, streaming fragments showering back down to the planet. All around them, the fleet was withdrawing feeding pipes from the world. Vast intestinal tubules, uplit from the growing planet, waved stiffly in the sky below, but many already seemed damaged by the ancient terraforming device. "It's working," Adair said gleefully. But Anditz felt only a strange emptiness at the sight of the glowing ball of energy that the planet had become. The battlefields and places where he and his regiment, where humanity had struggled, were all gone, all unmade. Even the device itself, the terraforming machine that had made Lazulai what it was now disassembled, and nothing but light was left. The story ends with a positive idea. Its activation unit was retrieved. This unit, while not the device itself, could potentially hold valuable data or insights that the Imperium could use, and the Adeptus Mechanicus could potentially replicate the device's technology. I really enjoyed that story because it was kind of a clever way to create something that can deal some serious harm to the Tyranids. Quite frankly, I don't know how they can really adapt their way out of this, because if you can't tell what's happening in that passage, the world engine, this planet terraformer, is terraforming the planet when they use it. But because the Tyranids are on the planet, and because Tyranids are, biomaterial, they don't use weapons in the traditional sense. They are organic monsters. It is reforming everything on the planet, all of the people on the planet, but also all of the Tyranids on the planet. And so some of the Tyranids do survive, the ones out in space, for example, but they do deal a massive blow to the invading Tyranids, and they do ensure that the planet will survive in some way. And quite frankly, even just terraforming planets is a massive thing in Warhammer 40k. It is not something that comes up very often. It has come up before, sort of. So in the book Belisarius Cawl, The Great Work, Belisarius Cawl does say he can kind of heal the planet of Sotha, which had previously been devoured by Tyranids, but to do that, he's basically kind of pulling resources from other planets and kind of reseeding the planet, and it will take 350 years. As you saw, that process was far quicker, and it can reform a planet relatively quickly. And in theory, if you can use this technology, you can create planets as you need them. So that planet is quite specific in that it's got all of these, you've got lots of jewels throughout the planet, and they very clearly, they don't look exactly natural. Their jewels are bursting up way higher into the planet's crust than you would expect typically. But in theory, you can make planets with far more of whatever kind of resources the Imperium needs. And certainly something the Imperium might need, because in the process of fighting the Tyranids, many worlds are lost. In Devastation of Baal, for example, we actually see the Blood Angels commit worlds to Exterminatus. They would rather just sacrifice a planet and evacuate as many people as possible than allow that planet to be consumed by the Nids, because if the Nids can consume the planet, they grow every single time. And so it's kind of a unique thing to have this in the setting as a possibility. Now, as I said in the reading there, the device is lost officially. However, the book makes a big point at the end of saying the activation trigger is kept. As well as that, there's a character who dies in the novel, Adept Wraith, who is hinted that maybe she can return in some way. Additionally, the Magos who kind of uncovers this device is not present at the end. So there are multiple ways set up at the end of the novel, hinting at ways in which characters, or at least information regarding the device, can come back. The Adeptus Mechanicus, or the Cog Boys as the Catachan refer to them, will kind of, reverse engineer this technology within the Adeptus Mechanicus and therefore create new of these devices. And that is allowed within the Adeptus Mechanicus methodology. So there's a slight misapprehension with the Adeptus Mechanicus. They hate all kinds of innovation. That's not technically true. What they hate is you innovating kind of new things beyond what humanity has ever had before. So the Adeptus Mechanicus view humanity in the dark age of technology as like essentially kind of the best technology, which doesn't mean the most advanced, it's just the best. You can make the things that they made, that's absolutely fine. But what you can't do is make kind of new things. That's seen as heretical. The idea that they might take this device and kind of form something new is right up their street, and especially up the street of someone like Belisari is cool, which is pretty exciting. I think this is definitely something that they'll kind of follow up with in the future. I think this book has been pretty popular, which is always a good sign, because if we want these storylines to be followed up on, we need people to buy and read the books. So do check out the books. And that book, I will say, definitely worth reading, especially for someone who's kind of new to Warhammer 40K. It is, the most 40K book I've ever read. If it had Space Marines in it, at least it would be. There's a character called Khan. They have to go and find a Magos across the planet, and they end up finding a very powerful weapon at the end, which is just so peak 40K. If you play any Space Marine game, you'll be very familiar with that kind of plot line already. It comes up all the time. Imagine the bioform the Tyranids would make if they got hold of the Emperor. That would be GG for the setting, in my opinion. It's a fair question, which makes you wonder. So the old law of rogue traders always had this idea that Imperial writs that they have like some of the drop of the Emperor's blood on them. And in theory, if the Drukhari or the Tyranids got a hold of that droplet of blood, that's a massive deal. And in fact, in the story Dark City, there's a whole plot line around Dark Eldar potentially getting like a couple of, dead cells of the Emperor. The Drukhari say they could use that to make something, horrific, basically. But let's explain that in another video. Old ass Imperium was making nonsense, man. What do you mean you made an evaporating terraform device? Definitely never had to deal with a death world back then. Yeah, I mean, true. I mean, the funny thing about old humanity in Warhammer 40K is that their terraforming capabilities were so extreme and their technology was so advanced. There's this suggestion in the Horus Heresy that the planet of Fenris, the homeworld of the Space Wolves, was made as kind of like a theme park, which is why it's kind of this horrific place to live in, because it was made to be this world that would be like a vacation spot for people who wanted to have a holiday being a Viking for a day, which is kind of hilarious. And Leman Russ has actually offered the opportunity at one point to fix a lot of Fenris's problems and make it a far nicer place to live, and he turns that down because he wants the Vilka Fenrica to be these kind of hardy warriors that, of course, we all know them to be. The Orcs will never stop the bugs. I want them to. I mean, this is one of the reasons one of the things that got me thinking about this video. I want to see some big Tyranid losses. I was quite disappointed in the next book we're going to look at to see the Imperium kind of flail so much in their battles versus the Tyranids. I feel like at this point, we should be doing a better job. Tyranid adaptation is not that quick. It's not like Tyranids have adapted to lasgun fire, and so now lasguns don't work against the Tyranids. It's not that effective. So it often gets overblown. And the Ultramarines, especially, have fought in every single tyrannic war in some way. So they are very accustomed to dealing and fighting against the Tyranids. They have tyrannic war veterans. And the next book we're going to talk about, which is Leviathan by Darius Hinks, I was kind of surprised to see the Ultramarines not do very well against them. They seemingly don't understand the way the psychic works amongst the Tyranids and the way the synapse works. They don't seem to be using the words that we all know, and the Ultramarines should know. They seem to be taken surprised somewhat by Genestealer cultists. At this point, when the Tyranids approach, you've got to be expecting Genestealer cultists to come out Ultramarines. Of course you've got to be expecting them. They're always going to come out. Would chaos allow Tyranids to destroy humanity? It's a great question. This does come up in the Devastation of Baal book, if you're interested in this storyline. So in that story, Kobanda, who is this kind of great enemy of the Blood Angels and a greater demon of Khorne, one of the favored of Khorne, he actually kind of comes to the Blood Angels' defense and ends up wiping out all of these Tyranids on one moon with loads of Khornate demons when the Great Rift opens and like the sky essentially opens, all these demons pour out. And the Khornate demons wipe out all of these Tyranids because, Karbanda's belief is that if anyone is going to kill the Blood Angels, it's going to be me. To a degree, I think you're right. I think that I don't think it would ever get to this stage, but I do think there's a possibility that you would see something like the Chaos Gods coordinate to weirdly try and save humanity. I think going forward, you'll probably quite consistently see team-ups going on, Imperium and Necrons versus Orcs and, Tau versus Necrons. I think you'll see these all the time because, quite frankly, there are so many overwhelming threats and they have to be dealt with each time. It would be cool to see more Dark Cells weapons. It would be. I'm also really hoping that we do see more Dark Angels weapons. It's never properly explored, and I've looked for it many times. But one of the things that it said in the Horus Heresy is that the Dark Angels armory is so impressive because the Emperor loved the Lion, gave him so many weapons, that the armory of the Dark Angels rivaled that of the Adeptus Custodes, or the Legio Custodes at the time. Presumably, they still have all that stuff, or at least most of it. Some of it was used during the Heresy, and presumably has been used over the last 10,000 years. But I'd like to think that, the Dark Angels still have a good amount of stuff in their vaults, and I think that would be a pretty cool way to have the Lion become this huge asset, because he does have all of these tools at his disposal, presumably, because there's no rule saying that or law ever saying that they lost them or anything like that. And so the Dark Angels still have this, firepower that no one else really has. It would be cool to see the Lion unleash that kind of stuff upon the galaxy once more. And he does so multiple times against the Adeptus Mechanicus in the Horus Heresy and Great Crusade. Or, Mechanicum back then. So Fenrisians are just weird cosplayers. Yeah, that's a good point. Kind of embarrassing, isn't it, really? The fact that you also dress like Vikings. They must have just found a lot of old costumes and they were like, yeah, this looks good. We'll dress like that. Can we not have the Necrons waking up be the answer to the Tyranids? That's a pretty solid idea. It doesn't feel, at the very least, like the Orcs stand a very good chance of beating the Tyranids meaningfully. However, given that the Tyranids and the Necrons are both big problems for the setting, the Necrons can throw black holes at people, right? So given that these are such big issues for the Imperium, a nice middle ground would be to make it so that the Tyranids and the Necrons are essentially kind of, bogging each other down. So this is the first weapon that the Imperium has at their disposal, this terraforming weapon, which can be used to essentially assure mutual destruction against the Tyranids as the Tyranids invade planets, which is something in and of itself, which is very Imperium. Essentially, you sacrifice the people on it, but you take the Tyranids with you and save the planet, the jewel of the Emperor, as it were. Or what they could do is maybe kind of, and this would be pushing it, but in theory, you could do something like create a weapon that utilizes the part of the terraforming technology which breaks down organics, breaks down biomaterial, and you could just fire that kind of beam at the Tyranids and it would work. That seems less likely, but I prefer the first option, and it fits the Imperium really well. You've got this story wherein you've got these defenders of humanity. They're holding out against the Tyranids. It's not going well, but they're doing their best. And then one day an Inquisitor rocks up, and they think, "Oh, we're getting aid, we're getting support." The Inquisitor activates a weapon which reforms the planet with everybody on it. That feels pretty inquisitorial to me. Anyway, let's move on to the second book we're going to talk about today. And this book is called Leviathan, which, as you might be able to guess, is about Hive Fleet Leviathan. This book is written by Darius Hinks, and it was the book that accompanied 10th edition. So it's specifically about the current Tyrannic War, although weirdly, Deathworlder doesn't actually specify which Hive Fleet it is, or at least I couldn't see it in any of the books. Presumably it's Hive Fleet Leviathan, but it might technically be a different Hive Fleet. Anyway, this is a story about the Ultramarines and their battle against the encroaching Hive Fleet Leviathan. When the story begins, the Ultramarines' primary objective is to defend the planet Redium and the Sanctus Line, a crucial network of fortifications protecting the Sol system from invasion. Early on, the Ultramarine ship, the Incorruptible, was ambushed. The Tyranids seemed to possess even deadlier insight into the plans of the Imperials than ever. In particular, there is a Norn emissary known as the Harbinger. The Harbinger was not simply a mindless predator, but a cunning and strategic leader, capable of understanding and manipulating even the Ultramarines. The Xenos attacked only in small numbers, but they were unusually focused, advancing with incredible speed and destabilizing the ship's superstructure. Tragically, the ship is lost. However, the sons of Guilliman, it seems, discover something much more valuable in return. When Lieutenant Tyrus beheaded a Neurogaunt, bizarrely, some of the corpses nearby twitched and clattered to the floor. Furthermore, during the battle, both the ship's crew and the Tyranids seemed to be behaving strangely, almost mad. Apothecary biologist Voltis took great interest in this turn of events. His role in the chapter goes beyond just treating wounds and preserving the chapter's gene seed. His every waking moment is spent examining and researching the species that the Space Marines have been bred to abhor. He lifted the piece of Tyranid Tyrus had cut away, and they both saw that it was a small creature that had been attached to a larger one. It was still alive, thrashing and struggling as Voltis locked pincers around it. Then he used one of the tools on his backpack to drill through its carapace. As the drill bit sank deeper, the surrounding corpses juddered again. Voltis forced this specimen into a container canister on his belt and manages to escape the Incorruptible on a launch to Redium. Henceforth, he became focused on these armoured symbionts, or neurocytes, attached to the larger Tyranids, and he sought an understanding of their purpose and function. Voltis came to believe that they held the key to explaining the unusual Tyranid and thereby human behaviour witnessed on the Incorruptible. "Only a small cluster of Tyranids attacked the Incorruptible," he said. "They should have been easy to deal with. The creatures that attacked us were mostly man-sized, clad in a chitinous outer shell and armed with bladed forelimbs, like many Tyranid warrior breeds we have faced before. The only difference was an armoured symbiont fastened to their backs, a form of neurocyte. I suspect that the symbionts act as a beacon, perhaps pheromonal. I have observed similar traits in swarming insects, but as well as summoning more Tyranids, I surmise that they release chemicals to confuse their prey, and this somehow hinders communication networks. This is why we were unable to communicate clearly when the Incorruptible was attacked. The presence of the Tyranids had a dramatic effect on the baseline humans who were on the ship. They lost all sense of self. Many became psychotic. The thing affected me too, not to the same extent as the unmodified humans, but," he shook his head, "when I saw the Harbinger, I thought it was a creature of the warp, one of the unborn. My vision was clouded, and my mind projected all kinds of absurd images." What's especially interesting about the Norn emissary known as the Harbinger is that Voltis knew its name as soon as he saw it. These events set Voltis on a path of scientific inquiry, and through his laboratory research, he theorizes that certain bugs within the Tyranid swarm act as psychic relays, allowing the Tyranid command beasts to control and coordinate their swarms through telepathy rather than pheromones. I'm attempting to recreate the tumult I saw on the Incorruptible. I want to induce an alarm response by injecting bioengineered hormones. One of my theories is that these parasites relay pheromone signals to the rest of the creatures. If I can simulate those biological signals, I may be able to pervert them. I could perhaps even turn them into a weapon that would confound the Tyranid leaders. But nothing I attempt triggers a response. The Tyranids are ever-changing. They are like a virus, adapting to our galaxy, adapting to a new challenge. And, in this particular swarm, perhaps these parasites are how the dominant creatures control the lesser ones. When Tyranids attack, they follow a prescribed pattern. It is one of the few predictable things about them. They appear to have specific invasion stages. If we could understand how these parasites interact with each other, we could alter the sequence and throw their attacks into disarray. Perhaps I have been approaching this from the wrong direction. Perhaps this symbiont uses telepathy rather than chemical signals. Perhaps it is a form of psyker. But I will need another specimen. It is the only way to test the theory. I need to see how they interact with each other. Voltis's obsession with the neurogaunts and belief that he can use neurocytes to fashion a weapon creates tension and mistrust amongst his fellow Ultramarines. His single-minded pursuit of knowledge and his fascination with Xenos biology are seen as almost unsettling. Nevertheless, he is able to retrieve another symbiont. The experiment can begin, and for a moment it looked like it might work. I think I have created a neural network, and if I have, that would mean I can influence the ratiocination process. I can disrupt the homeostasis of the entire swarm. Baraka raised an eyebrow. Ratiocination? Their thought process, he said, frustrated that he had to explain such simple terms. If I really can influence it, I can direct them. They could become erratic and ineffectual. I could take that idea much further. Unfortunately for Voltis and the world of Rhedium, his experiment failed. One of the specimens died, and with it, Rhedium was lost. The biologist is incapable of replicating the psychic signals they could use to disrupt the Tyranid hive mind. With this plan a failure and the planet on its way to belonging to the Tyranids, Lieutenant Castamon of the Ultramarines makes a difficult decision. We could detonate the planet. They will consume every ounce of Rhedium's biomass, and they will reproduce, becoming an even larger threat. Then, having removed this linchpin of the Sanctus line, they will advance deep into Segmentum Solar, consuming countless worlds and billions of people en route to the Sol System. If that happens, the best we can hope for is that Lord Commander Guilliman redeploys his forces to tackle the new threat. If he focuses huge amounts of resources on the Xenos, he may be able to stop them. But in doing so, he will leave himself exposed on dozens of fronts, allowing heretic Astartes and cultists to regain ground and tighten their stranglehold. Or, if he fails to stop the Xenos, they may reach Terra and the steps of the Golden Throne itself. Either way, the future of the entire Imperium would be in the balance. With this realization, the Ultramarines devise a plan. There is a calcification pump network throughout the planet, deep beneath the surface. If they can get a plasma reactor and drop it down a geoengine shaft, this could cause a planet-wide cataclysm, a chain reaction that would destroy the planet. Their plan is successful, and Voltis escapes with his lieutenant. Nevertheless, the biologist took his failure and the loss of one of the Emperor's worlds hard. He had been so close. The others had doubted him, but he was sure he had been on the cusp of granting the Imperium an incredible weapon, a way to stop this happening again. The reactor would halt the invasion of Rhedium, but there were other Tyranid swarms spreading across the galaxy. Other fleets that might also be heading to the Sanctus line. And, with Rhedium gone, the chain would be broken. A sense of fatalism gripped him. He was not meant to die down there. The symbionts had to be preserved and weaponized. It was his fate. He had never felt like this before, and it was exactly the kind of mysticism he would have ridiculed Baraka for. But down there, in the vision-haunted darkness, it seemed to make sense. Later on, as Vultus worked, he played a scene over and over in his mind. It was the moment on Regium when he had failed to control the symbionts. He had been so close, some minor detail had eluded him. That was all. As soon as he and Castamon reached somewhere safe, he would demand tools and a space to work. The people of Regium had made the ultimate sacrifice, but it was, at best, a stalling tactic. The Great Devourer never stopped, and now it had broken the Sanctus line. There was a crack in the dam. More Tyranids would be on their way. He had to make the sacrifice worth something. He looked at the canisters fixed to his belt. The other worlds in the Sanctus line had to be warned. He had to find the answer. The Ultramarines suffered a big blow in that story, and Terra was potentially under threat. The only way to kind of not even defeat the Tyranids, but to release a little bit of tension for Roboute Guilliman was for the Ultramarines to basically detonate this planet, and everyone on it is lost, or at least lots of people on it are lost. Interestingly, that book is really fascinating in seeing the impact that the Tyranids have on a planet as they invade, and how everyone kind of starts falling under the kind of the sway of the hive mind, and gene stealer cults start rising up. But there is hope at the end of that book. Again, that book ends with no solid answer, but we have got hope, and the Imperium once again has got another weapon they can start developing that should ideally have massive impact on fighting back against the Tyranids. So this is going to be a weapon that would disrupt essentially the synapse links between the Tyranids. So the leader beasts would no longer be able to kind of direct the smaller Tyranids, and that would ultimately mean that they kind of revert their kind of animalistic signals. And if the Tyranids aren't all directed by one swarm, they're just a load of if the Tyranids aren't all directed by the leader beast, they basically turn into animals and become a lot easier to manage. So I guess we'll see. Vultus in that passage, he actually even implies that one of the things he may be able to do is kind of control the Tyranids if he ends up utilizing this technology and understanding that technology enough, which was pretty cool. This is a completely new kind of Space Marine character within the setting to have kind of an apothecary biologist, and it was really interesting in the novel to see how he makes other Space Marines kind of uncomfortable, this random apothecary, because he's so obsessed with the Tyranids and finding an answer to the Tyranid threat that they feel kind of weird when they're around him, and it seems almost heretical, one might say. So it's but he does potentially have the answer. And the reason that this is going to be like a big plot line going forward is actually connected to something else that happens in the video, which I'll play for you now as well, where in this story we actually find out that the hive mind is specifically quite focused on Roboute Guilliman. It's very much aware of Roboute Guilliman's existence, aware that he's kind of the Lord Commander of the Imperium, and this being, the Harbinger, is killed in the story, but it's the Norn emissaries are bred for a purpose, and this Norn emissary, it looks like this Norn emissary was bred to kill Guilliman, and we find that out earlier in this story, where as Apothecary Vultus is conducting his experiments on these kind of neuropsites, he touches one of them, and he actually gets a vision, a glimpse inside of the Harbinger's mind.
Vultus studied his captives. Even though they were small and imprisoned, they triggered a powerful wave of revulsion in him. The chamber was lit by fierce strip lumens that revealed every grotesque detail. Vultus had a huge respect for predators. Many of the specimens in his laboratorium were far more impressive in a scientific capacity than the humans he was sworn to protect. But when he looked at the two symbionts, he felt only disgust. He removed his gauntlets and put his hands into the holes on the side of the casket, sliding his fingers into gloves that hung inside the box. The specimen attacked instantly, attempting to bite into his hand, but failing to puncture the thick gloves. As he gripped the symbiont tighter, an image flickered across his thoughts. It was so vivid, he grunted in surprise. He saw a command chamber, wreathed in perfumed smoke. The walls were draped in banners, and the air was thrumming with the power of plasma drives. There was a single, colossal figure in the room, hunched over a stone table, poring over charts and scrolls. Even though the warrior was hazed by smoke, he was unmistakable. It was Roboute Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar and Lord Commander of the entire Imperium. Voltis could name every piece of his Primarch's armour and weaponry, from the armour of fate with its layers of intricate filigree to the huge sword once carried by the Emperor himself. It should have been a glorious sight, but rather than feeling elated, Voltis felt a wave of dread. There was something else in the chamber, something that should not be there, something that radiated insatiable hunger. Dust billowed around the feet of the statues, and shadows lurched as it approached, and somehow the Lord Commander was oblivious. Whatever the threat was, Guilliman was blind to it, too focused on his maps and books to realize that he was in danger. Then the command chamber was gone, and Voltis saw the laboratorium again.
So it looks like we're going to get this kind of follow-up to this book. At least I believe we're going to get a follow-up to this book, because there's these kind of two really interesting plot lines that I took away as being a big fan of. The firstly is the idea that the Hive Mind is kind of obsessed with Guilliman, and Guilliman is a fantastic opponent for the Hive Mind to have because he's so good at handling kind of complex problems, which is what the Tyranids are. They're a battle of resources more than anything, really. And additionally, we have this unfinished plot line, and the book ends with the kind of the dedication of Apothecary Voltis to try and find the answer to this problem and create his weapon, and this weapon will be able to disrupt the Hive Mind and will hopefully lead to a massive Tyranid victory. Now, in both of these stories, we see weapons that could be used against the Tyranids, and I think these are important because the Tyranids are a massive problem for Warhammer 40k. Realistically, we all want to kind of, we're all fans of the lore, but we all want the lore to kind of get on to the Lion meeting up with Guilliman. We've got other Primarchs to come back. The Drukhari need their resurgence. The Craftworld Eldar need their resurgence. And of course, we've got the Pariah Nexus story coming up in the future. So I think getting the Tyranids to kind of another stalemate is important, because at the moment, the Tyranid threat is so extreme. Terror itself is under threat. It's one of those things you can't really take a lot of stories seriously now in this heading, because it's like, hang on, shouldn't people be talking more about the Tyranids? Because the Tyranids, terror is in the path of Tyranids. If you lose terror, you lose everything. So I want to see a big Ultramarines victory. And the only thing about that book that I didn't like, and I've spoken about this before, is that throughout a lot of that book, the Ultramarines are quite bad fighting against the Tyranids. They kind of walk into a trap. They are unfamiliar with how Synapse works and how gene stealer cults work and all these kind of things. And you fought in 4 Tyrannic wars. You should know how to deal with these guys. So I would love to see a big Ultramarine victory. I think that's where the storyline should go, and fundamentally, I think it's kind of needed at this point in time. And it would be a nice balance for the setting, because at the moment it just feels like there's no point. The Tyranids are too oppressive. It just doesn't really feel like there's any point in any of the stories sometimes. Lord Emissary is a centerpiece model, makes sense from a marketing point of view. That way players can imagine their centerpiece models fighting. Yeah, I mean, that's true. The Norn Emissary is a beautiful kind of new model within the setting, and they were introduced in this kind of massive way, because if you're not familiar, the one Norn Emissary killed, I think it was 7 members of the Adeptus Custodes, and normally in 40k books, outside of some very questionable writing choices, the Adeptus Custodes or the Legio Custodes were seen to be, almost unbeatable, except to the greatest of foes. And so for one Tyranid to kill
so many members of the Adeptus Custodes, it was a massive deal. Such an Ultramarines fanboy. I am an Ultramarines fanboy. I do like the Ultramarines. You can't not like the Ultramarines. They're just kind of, there's so much lore to them. You know, you can't hate all Ultramarines. You know, you're gonna hate Ventress and Cato Sicarius and Marnius Cowgar and, you know, Lieutenant Titus. You can't hate all of them, surely. But the rate at which GW goes, I'll be 80 before I know what happens. It's a fair point. I mean, we've talked about this a bit before, but maybe it's worth talking more about at some point, which is that the setting does feel quite slow at times. I will say the setting has always had this. It's always been very slow. If anything, it moves faster now than ever before. I think it's just like, now that the ball gets rolling, it kind of sucks to have them kind of put a break on things. And because of the nature of the Indomitus Crusade, and then them writing Dark Imperium, and they've already written Devastation of Baal, and then they've written Arcs of Omen, we move forward in the timeline, and then we move back, and in quite meaningful ways. And that kind of, I think, you know, knocks the wind out of you when you're reading the lore. So it kind of sucks that you know, we're not moving forward in the things, you know, people want. And GW know what we want, right? We want to see, you know, Primarchs, and we want to see. We should be getting. I haven't read the new Leagues of Votan book, but I'm excited to read that. So yeah, it's there's a lot of big lore they can kind of go down, and they have been going back to the Indomitus Crusade, and the fact that we're going back to Pariah Nexus. This is essentially the third time we've had a big focus on Pariah Nexus, and to be honest, we all kind of know where it's going. We know that it's going to lead to some sort of stalemate, and yeah, that's the inevitable conclusion. I do really believe that the Voltus storyline is probably how the fourth Tyrannic War ends. They basically do that, and the real advantage of the Voltus storyline is that it's something that the Tyranids can then adapt to. So it's not an all-encompassing victory for the Imperium against the Tyranids, because the next time there's a Hive fleet incursion, the Imperium will discover inevitably that they've adapted to have some sort of like shield or immunity to this kind of like anti-synapse device that the Ultramarines have made. So it's kind of a perfect answer for the Fourth Tyrannic War. In terms of the terraforming, I don't think the Tyranids have an answer to that. There's nothing you can really do about having your cells broken down on like a atomic level. So yeah, I guess I think that's probably more of it. But at least that one has the advantage in that, like, the Imperium would have to sacrifice a world each time they use that device, which they often, of course, won't want to do. But it would still be a pretty useful way to giving the Imperium some pretty big victories. Or at least, well, I say big, Pyrrhic victories, I guess, really, because they still lose a load of people on a planet. One thing about the terraforming is that eventually I know that there's 1 million worlds or so within the Imperium, but if the Emperors, the servants of the Emperor keep losing worlds at the rate they're losing, eventually there's not going to be that many left. So being able to terraform a few would be pretty useful to kind of make the setting feel more real and have even the stakes a bit. I think Chaos and the Imperium will ally for Nids. Probably pretty likely. So in the Beast Arises series, one of the plot lines in that is that you have an Imperial Fist successor who they end up allying with the Iron Warriors. And one of the Imperial Fists ends up joining this Iron Warriors warband at the end because they basically team up against the Orcs. So the idea of the Imperials and the traitors kind of teaming up to fight against the Orcs or the Tyranids or the Necrons totally makes sense. I think that's very much on brand. What are the chances Malgador comes back? Oh, pretty low, mate. I'll be honest. I'm sorry. I'd love to tell you it's more, but I don't think so. His sacrifices come somewhat central to the setting, and he is like torn apart, inside and out, and spiritually in terms of his soul when he's on the Golden Throne. Like he is. I don't think it's officially this anymore, but in the older look, it was like he was the first person that was like sacrificed. This is the first soul that goes to the Emperor. So it's his soul is kind of completely gone, and in a way, we still got the Inquisition. He's there in spirit. The reason the blueberries even exist is another example of plastic plot armor. In reality, Mars would have scoured them clean for their tech and audacity years ago. Don't know about that, but They do certainly get a lot more attention, and they do get particularly good. I mean, one thing about the storyline of Leviathan that really cracked me up, that really made me laugh when I realized this, was that, of course, the Ultramarines have like the most powerful apothecary. Like, if you're not familiar, there's old lore saying that Marnius Calgar was the liege lord of the all Space Marines. That's not consistent, but it was said. And then you have Tigurius, and in the first Tyrannic War, Tigurius demonstrates a power that far exceeds anything any other Space Marine has ever had. So in a way, nowadays we'd probably say Mephiston's more powerful, but historically it was like, oh, they've got the most powerful librarian. And now, and then they have things like Cato Sicarius, who's like, this incredible swordsman. It's like, of course they got the best swordsman. And now, of course, they have the best apothecary. And it's such an ultramarine thing to happen, isn't it? Which made me laugh. But hey ho, he also failed. So there we go. And things are a bit more even now, I'd say. I find it funny that people say the Necrons and Nids are overpowered. Interesting. Chaos split the galaxy in half. If the Emperor dies, every human becomes a demon portal, and they will operate at a multiversal scale. So I get what you're saying that, but what are the chances of Chaos doing that anytime soon? I guess I get what you're saying, and the Chaos is a big issue. But I think the reason people say Necrons and the Nids are overpowered is a bit different. With Necrons, it's because the Necrons have already defeated a foe that is so far beyond the Imperium, from what we know, that like it's just a joke that we're having a battle against them. We don't have an answer to the Necrons throwing I know I've used that analogy multiple times, but that's happened in the books. They throw a black hole at someone, and so it's like, okay, what if they throw a black hole at Terra? There's no answer to that. We just lose Terra. So it's that's why it seems so much. And then the Tyranids, of course, is because they can adapt to anything, any solution we find against them. They can, well, not any, but a lot of them they can kind of adapt to. And additionally, that they have seemingly unending numbers. Like I said, there's one story that says they think there's more Tyranid Hive fleet than there are planets, or more systems. I think that's it. And so I'm like, well, that's just good luck, guys. You don't stand a chance. There's no way in hell. It's just too much. It's way too powerful. I think a cool thing would be to find out that's wrong, that prediction is wrong, and that actually, there are far fewer Tyranids than we previously supposed. But that seems unlikely. They got many secrets yet to be revealed. Very true. Very true. If Abaddon stabs a Norn Queen with Drachnien, will the Hive Mind feed it? As in, like, would Drachnien absorb the soul? Probably not, because they're soulless. But in theory, you could do. Oh, if he stabbed a Norn Queen, I don't think a Norn Queen would do it. But if he stabbed the Hive Mind, maybe it would work. New to 40k. Thanks for the super chat, Black Cloud. Started learning with your videos. Amazing. Do you think the Emperor getting rid of religion during the Great Crusade made the Chaos Gods stronger, since people didn't have their native religions and beliefs? It's a very good question. And if you're new to 40k, you're in on a very big debate in Warhammer. That is the question. Did the Emperor make the right decision in doing this? I think that generally, if the Webway project had worked, I think that yes, it probably would have been the right decision. But because it didn't work, of course, it didn't work out. I do believe he should have spoken to his sons more. He should have spent more time with Lorgar and explained what was going on. Lorgar had, the Emperor was aware that Lorgar had this insatiable curiosity because it's his insatiable curiosity. So the Emperor, I think, should have realized that. First Heretic goes into that quite a lot. And that's kind of the big one, is that, he should have handled Lorgar better. But in terms of generally, should he have wiped out religion? I think it did make sense given his plans at the time. I guess you just have this question of, if you remove all religion, will it be filled with something? And inevitably, it was going to be worship of him or the Chaos Gods. But anyhow, I was hoping the final boss of Space Marine 2 would have been Magnus, as he's about to kill Titus and co. Miss Shroud everything. The Lion appears, and we play as the Lion for the fight. I mean, in terms of the Leviathan storyline, I really think that there's a great video game in tying in Leviathan, right? So you could have an expansion pack, $19.99. I'd pay it. And in that, you get digitally rendered Roboute Guilliman in and of itself, already worth the money. And then you have a storyline in which you're trying to activate this weapon that was created by Apothecary Voltis, and deal a deadly blow. Now that wouldn't like, the great thing about this plotline is that it doesn't completely destroy all of the Tyranids or anything like that. The Tyranids will adapt to it going forward, so you still have like the narrative reason to keep playing the game. But at the same time, it would be a really cool way to tie the game into the lore, and seems like the kind of thing they want to do, that they would be up for, because Space Marine 2 has been huge for the community. Yeah, Magnus would be pretty cool. I guess again it would have to be like when you fight against the Hive Tyrant, or is it Hive Tyrant? It's a Hive Tyrant, isn't it? When you fight against the Hive Tyrant, you'd have to like beat him in like a specific way, or I guess you do defeat a Lord of Change, don't you? So maybe it would work against Magnus. You could do something cool like that. Also be really cool to have like the one mission where you get like a Space Wolf support character or something wild like that. That would be awesome. So there we have it. We have 2 Tyranid killing weapons on the horizon. Both of them need a bit of fixing up. One of them has to be reverse engineered, and the other one has to be tweaked so that the symbionts don't die upon using them. But in theory, we have got 2 weapons here that could completely turn the tide against the 4th Tyrannic War. The reason I really like these weapons is because neither of them are, game ending against the Tyranids. The Tyranids can obviously adapt to the anti-synapse weapon that they're kind of creating, or at least Voltis and the Ultramarines are kind of making. And at the same time, the terraforming weapon is only really useful if the Tyranids have already invaded and have almost taken a planet. So the Imperium has to sacrifice a lot to lose this weapon, which is a pretty important kind of caveat to using it. However, in terms of ending the 4th Tyrannic War, they could be decisive, and I would love to see them doing in the future. Both of those books end with strong hints that they will continue the storyline forward. Voltis, of course, vows to finish doing the storyline. Voltis, of course, vows to continue finishing the weapon, and Roboute Guilliman is spied on in the novel, and so that storyline in and of itself will have to be continued at some point or another. And in terms of Deathworlder, where you have multiple characters that are hinted to come back in the future, and you also have, of course, the literal wording around the Cogboys attempting to reverse engineer this technology and maybe get something out of it. So I guess we'll see in the future. But both those books I would definitely recommend people checking out if you're interested. I wholeheartedly do believe that one of them, most likely the Voltis story, in my opinion, is going to be how the 4th Tyrannic War ends, and the Ultramarines will inevitably lead the Imperium to victory. But fingers crossed it will last long enough for the Lion and Guilliman to meet up in the future. We do know the Lion is fighting against Tyranids too, so there's definitely some in there. I hope, I hope it happens soon, and I think everyone's kind of really excited for that. Once we're through the Pariah Nexus storyline, which should come with the final Dawn of Fire book, at that point where 40k is mostly kind of caught up, and we can start pressing forward with ending the 4th Tyrannic War and inevitably pressing on to the next big Orc Incursion or Trukari raids or whatever it's going to be. So I can't really wait for that. But please do let me know in the comments, what do you guys think about these weapons? Are there any other big weapons in 40k that the Imperium has that you think might be useful? There are definitely other big kind of apocalypse weapons. We see them in Pariah Nexus. Belisarius Call authorizes the use of some of these kind of big apocalypse level weapons, but they are very dangerous to use, to put it mildly, and you can absolutely blow yourself and a lot of other people's selves up whilst using them. So you do have to be careful there. But yeah, let me know what you think. What do you think the best way to kill the Tyranids are? What do you think the Imperium's best strategy should be for fighting against the Tyranids? Maybe you could just let them come to Terra and have they could just enter the vicinity of the Emperor, and the Master of Mankind will just burn the hive mind from the inside out. That would be pretty satisfying.
And that's a wrap for today's stream. If you enjoy these kinds of Warhammer 40k lore breakdowns and discussions, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification so you don't miss me going live.
For those of you who want extra content and to support the channel, consider clicking the join button. Becoming a member will give you access to more videos and streams and our Discord community, where you can chat with other lore enthusiasts and myself. Thanks again for watching, look out for any Chaos or Genestealer cults in your area, and I'll see you next time.